If you search Prepper Stockpile on YouTube, you'll see the same familiar list repeated everywhere. Rice, beans, canned food, water. It's constant, and most creators present it like that's the full picture. But there's something people rarely say out loud. The more experienced preppers, the ones who've seen store shelves emptied in under 48 hours and lived through real supply chain disruptions, usually don't share their real stockpiles online. There's a simple reason for that. Revealing what you have can make you a target, and in a serious crisis, that's a risk people don't take lightly. So much of what you see online is really just surface-level guidance meant to keep things simple and widely shareable. What follows is a deeper look at what's actually stored by more serious preparedness circles, the kind of list that usually stays private and gets passed around quietly. There are 15 items in total, and item number 8 is especially interesting. It's something you almost never see mentioned in mainstream prepper content. Item 15 is hardtack. Most people have never even come across that term before, but it was enough to sustain Civil War soldiers for 4 solid years when they had nothing else. 4 years. Just take a second to really think about that. So why does that matter today? Because in any kind of emergency, bread is one of the very first things to vanish. Within just a few hours of a crisis being announced, bakery shelves across entire areas are completely wiped out. People crave bread. It feels filling, familiar, and like a proper meal. That's exactly the gap hardtack fills, and it does so in a way that lasts long-term. Here's something most folks aren't aware of. Hardtack is incredibly simple to make. It only uses 3 basic ingredients: flour, water, and salt. That's all there is to it. It's baked slowly at a low temperature until it becomes extremely hard, then stored in a dry environment, away from any moisture. When done properly, it can last anywhere from 50 to 100 years, which sounds unreal, but it's true. In fact, historians have discovered hardtack from the 1860s, dating back to the Civil War, that was still technically edible more than a century later. People who take prepping seriously often make batches themselves and seal them in airtight containers for long-term storage. You don't hear much about this online because once something like this gets widespread attention, supplies tend to disappear fast. If you want to take action, you don't even have to make it yourself. You can buy a ready-made version. Look up Sailor Boy Pilot Bread. It comes in sealed tins, usually costs under $10, and is still available online right now. Hardly anyone outside dedicated prepper communities even recognizes that product by name, but now you do. That said, hardtack on its own isn't enough to keep you going. What experienced preppers combine it with is item number 14, and its shelf life sounds almost unbelievable until you actually check it out for yourself. Item 14 is pemmican. Indigenous communities and Arctic explorers relied on this single food for months on end, sometimes without anything else, and still managed to keep going. Once you really understand what pemmican is made of, it starts to make perfect sense why it was so effective. In a true protein shortage, when fresh meat is gone from store shelves and even your zapas of beans is running low, pemmican becomes the thing that helps people keep functioning, not just barely survive. That's because it combines both fat and protein into one compact, shelf-stable food that doesn't require refrigeration at all. Finding that kind of nutritional balance in a single item is incredibly rare, which is what makes it so valuable. What a lot of people don't realize is that properly made pemmican, using dried meat, rendered beef fat, tallow, and dried berries, can last anywhere from 3 to 5 years under normal conditions. In some historical cases, it's lasted even longer, stretching into decades. When you look at the ratio of calories to shelf life, there really isn't another food that compares. Arctic explorers depended on it during long, brutal journeys across frozen landscapes, and many of them survived specifically because they had this one food with them. The good news is you can actually make it yourself at home without much trouble. Start with beef jerky, mix it with melted beef tallow, add in dried blueberries, grind everything down, press it into bars, and wrap it in wax paper for storage. People who are serious about preparedness tend to produce it in larger batches and simply rotate their supply every few years, which means they don't have to constantly worry about protein sources. If you'd rather not make it, there are also pre-made versions available from specialized survival brands online. Either way, it's something worth adding to your stockpile. And the next item? It's probably not what you're expecting. Item number 13 isn't anything rare or hard to find. In fact, It's something you've probably passed by countless times in a place like Walmart without giving it a second thought. The difference is in how serious preppers approach it, the type they choose, the way they store it, and especially the amount they keep on hand. We're talking about iodized salt in bulk. You'll hear people say, stock up on salt, all the time, but they rarely explain how much you actually need or why that word iodized on the label is far more important than most people realize. Here's the part that almost never gets discussed. Iodine deficiency can turn into a serious health issue when access to regular food is disrupted. It can lead to thyroid problems, mental fog, and extreme fatigue, exactly the kind of issues you can't afford when you need to stay sharp and physically capable. This wasn't just theoretical either. Before iodized salt became common, widespread iodine deficiency was a real problem during Great Depression. And in a long-term emergency where your normal diet disappears, those same conditions could come back faster than most people expect. That's why experienced preppers don't just keep a small container in the kitchen. They store a minimum of 10 pounds per person. Not a shaker. 10 full pounds. And there's a solid reason behind that number. Salt isn't just for flavor. It serves multiple critical purposes all at once. It helps preserve meat, extends the shelf life of dairy, and can even be used as a basic antiseptic rinse for minor wounds. On top of that, it helps replenish electrolytes when you're losing fluids through hard physical work. And in a prolonged crisis, it becomes incredibly valuable for trading, almost like a form of currency. Think of it as a multi-purpose survival tool in mineral form. And the best part? It never expires. When buying, go for something like Morton canning and pickling salt in large bags. It's free of anti-caking agents and additives, just pure sodium chloride, which means it stores indefinitely without issues. A good baseline is at least 3 large bags per person, sealed inside a food-grade bucket to keep moisture out. It's easily one of the most affordable and practical items you can add to your supply. Now, item number 12 is something most people throw away without thinking. And once you hear how experienced preppers use it instead, it's going to feel like you've been tossing out value for years. Item 12 is pure ascorbic acid powder. Most people just throw away those tiny packets that come in packaging, but serious preppers take a completely different approach. They buy it in bulk, often by the pound, and there's a very deliberate reason behind that. Here's something a lot of people don't realize. Throughout history, scurvy has taken down more military campaigns than actual combat. That might sound dramatic, but it's a well-documented reality. Once access to fresh fruits and vegetables is cut off, it doesn't take long. Within a few weeks, vitamin C deficiency starts to set in. And when it does, the effects are brutal. Teeth begin to loosen or fall out, joints break down, energy levels crash, and if it goes unchecked, it can eventually become fatal. Most people associate scurvy with old pirate stories from centuries ago, like something out of the 1700s. But it's not some outdated disease. It's simply what happens when fresh produce is no longer available. And in any prolonged crisis, fresh fruits and vegetables are usually among the first things to disappear. That's where ascorbic acid powder comes in. It's just vitamin C in its purest form, and it's surprisingly affordable, around $15 per pound. When stored properly in a sealed glass container and kept away from light, it can last indefinitely. What makes it especially valuable is that it serves 2 purposes. First, it helps support your immune system when your diet is limited to dry or shelf-stable foods for long periods. Second, it can be used in home canning to slow down oxidation, helping preserve other foods and extend their shelf life naturally. A single pound is enough to provide daily supplementation for a family of 4 for about 6 months, which makes it incredibly efficient. A commonly recommended option is Anthony's ascorbic acid powder, which is easy to find online. For storage, just transfer it into a sealed glass mason jar and keep it somewhere cool, dark, and dry. That's all it takes. With a simple one-time purchase, you've got a long-lasting backup that's both affordable and often overlooked. Arguably one of the most underrated items on this entire list. Now, item number 11 is interesting because both experienced preppers and professional nutritionists agree on its importance, but for completely different reasons. And once you hear both perspectives, it'll make perfect sense why it made this list. Item 11 is nutritional yeast. At first glance, it can seem a bit off-putting, both in appearance and smell, especially if you've never used it before. But don't let that fool you. This stuff basically acts like a compact vitamin powerhouse that you can keep right on your shelf. Here's the issue it addresses. During a long-term crisis, getting enough vitamin B12 becomes extremely difficult without consistent access to meat or dairy products. And when your body runs low on B12, the consequences are serious. Nerve damage, mental decline, and overwhelming fatigue can all set in. Not exactly what you want when you need to stay sharp and physically capable. The problem is most typical emergency foods, like rice, beans, pasta, and flour, contain little to no B12 at all. That creates a major nutritional gap that a lot of people don't even realize they're leaving unaddressed. Nutritional yeast fills that gap surprisingly well. It's packed with B vitamins, including B12, and if stored properly in a sealed container, it can last for over 2 years. And here's the part that catches people off guard. It actually tastes good. It has a rich, savory flavor that's often compared to cheese, which can make a huge difference when you're eating the same bland foods day after day. You can sprinkle it over rice, stir it into beans, or mix it into just about anything. It genuinely helps turn basic survival meals into something more enjoyable. That's why nutritionists value it for its vitamin content, while preppers rely on it to make a repetitive emergency diet more sustainable over time. A popular and trusted option is Bragg nutritional yeast. If you're getting it, go for the larger bulk bags instead of the small shaker containers. Once you bring it home, transfer it into a sealed glass jar and store it in a cool, dark place. It typically runs around $12 per pound, and 1 bag per person can last about 3 months with daily use. Once you understand how much it covers nutritionally, it quickly becomes one of those items you don't want to go without. Now we're getting into the part of the list that rarely gets talked about publicly. Item number 10 might sound completely ordinary at first, but the difference in shelf life compared to what most people are storing right now is massive. We're talking about a gap of 28 years. Item 10 is wheat berries. Not flour, but the full, intact grain in its natural, unprocessed form straight from the plant. And that small detail makes a huge difference when it comes to long-term storage. Here's why that matters. Regular all-purpose flour typically goes bad within 6 to 12 months. A lot of preppers stock up on flour thinking they've secured their baking and bread supply for years, but that's simply not the case. At best, they've covered themselves for about a year, and that's assuming everything is stored under ideal conditions. After that point, the flour loses its viability and goes stale. It's no longer something you can rely on. Wheat berries, on the other hand, are a completely different story. When stored properly in mylar bags with oxygen absorbers, they can last indefinitely. For example, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which operates some of the most thorough long-term food storage programs, has tested wheat berries that were over 30 years old and found that they retained nearly all of their nutritional value. But what really makes wheat berries stand out isn't just their shelf life, it's their versatility. From a single product, you get 3 distinct survival uses. You can grind them into fresh flour whenever you need it, giving you a reliable way to bake on demand. You can also sprout them in just a few days, turning them into fresh greens, something incredibly valuable when access to vegetables is limited. Or you can cook them whole, similar to rice or grains, for a filling and nutritious meal. So with one item, you're covering multiple food needs, all while benefiting from an extremely long shelf life. If you're looking to stock up, hard red winter wheat is a solid choice. Suppliers like Azure Standard or Honeyville are commonly used sources. For proper storage, seal the wheat in mylar bags with around 300 cubic centimeters oxygen absorbers. Then place those bags inside food-grade buckets with gamma seal lids. As a general guideline, 1 5-gallon bucket per person can cover several months' worth of grain and flour needs. And right now, since most people outside of serious prepper circles aren't paying attention to this specific item, it's still easy to find at normal prices. I mentioned item number 8 earlier. We're getting close. But first, number 9, and this one will completely change how you look at a very common breakfast staple. Item 9 is oat groats. Not oatmeal and not rolled oats, but the whole oat kernel in its completely unprocessed form. That difference alone completely changes how it performs for long-term storage. Here's the issue with rolled oats that most people never really think about. Even under good conditions, they only last about 2 to 5 years. Instant oats tend to break down even faster. A lot of preppers stock up on rolled oats, feel confident that they've covered breakfast for the long haul, and don't think much further about it. But in any situation that extends beyond a few years, or if storage conditions aren't ideal, those oats can spoil or lose quality long before other staples ever run out. Whole oat groats stored properly in mylar bags with oxygen absorbers are in a completely different category. They can remain stable for 30 years or more while still retaining most of their nutritional value. This isn't just speculation either. It's been confirmed through long-term food storage testing, including programs like those run by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which consistently report strong preservation results over decades. Beyond just shelf life, oat groats also offer better nutrition than rolled oats in several ways. They tend to have a lower glycemic impact, along with higher fiber and protein content per serving. So this isn't just a storage improvement, it's also a nutritional upgrade. You can find oat groats through suppliers like Bob's Red Mill or Azure Standard. For storage, the process is the same as with wheat berries. Seal them in mylar bags with oxygen absorbers, then place those bags inside food-grade buckets with gamma seal lids. As a general rule, one 5-gallon bucket per person can provide roughly 6 months of breakfast staples. And because most people outside serious preparedness circles aren't buying them in large quantities right now, prices and availability are still fairly normal, but that likely won't last forever. You mentioned item 8 at the start of the video. Here it is. Item 8 is freeze-dried butter powder, essentially real butter transformed into a powdered form. It offers around a 5-year shelf life and doesn't require any refrigeration, which is why it's almost completely unknown outside serious preparedness circles. Here's why this matters more than most people initially realize. In a survival situation where your diet is mostly dry staples like grains and beans, the lack of fat becomes a serious problem, both physically and mentally. Fat is the most calorie-dense nutrient available, and without it, people can end up feeling constantly hungry even when they're technically eating enough food. That ongoing sense of hunger, combined with low energy and mental fatigue, is often what leads to poor decisions and burnout during long-term emergencies. Butter powder helps solve that issue in a very practical way. It can be rehydrated with water, used in baking, and substituted in recipes that normally call for regular butter. The flavor is surprisingly close to real butter, close enough that in a crisis situation, it can make the difference between feeling like you're eating a proper meal versus just surviving on rations. Because of that, experienced preppers started quietly recommending it to one another years ago. It's rarely discussed publicly, and whenever it does get attention online, it tends to sell out quickly. A commonly referenced option is Hoosier Hill Farm butter powder, which is widely available on platforms like Amazon. A single pound can last a family for months of cooking, depending on usage. For storage, it's best kept sealed in its original container in a cool, dark place. Once opened, transferring it into a glass jar with a silica gel packet helps preserve freshness for longer. Before we move on to item 7, take a moment. If you're writing these down, let me know which item has surprised you the most so far in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time, because the next video builds directly on this one. It covers storage systems, rotation schedules, and the containers that actually hold up long-term. But for now, let's get back to the list. Item 7 is whole black peppercorns. Ancient spice traders who helped build massive trade networks across continents weren't primarily moving gold. They were transporting this. There's a reason peppercorns held value above silver for over 1,000 years in human history. Once ground, pepper loses most of its strength within about 6 months. After that, it becomes little more than dull, flavorless powder that people still sprinkle on food more out of habit than impact. A lot of preppers stock pre-ground pepper and assume they've handled spices for the long term, but in reality, they've only covered themselves for roughly half a year. Whole peppercorns, on the other hand, retain their full flavor and natural antimicrobial qualities for about 3 to 4 years when sealed properly. Under ideal storage conditions, some sources suggest they can last even longer. In fact, marine archaeologists have recovered peppercorns from a sunken Roman ship that were still aromatic and chemically active after roughly 2,000 years underwater, which speaks to just how stable they can be. Beyond taste, black pepper contains piperine, a compound that helps the body absorb nutrients more efficiently from other foods. In a survival diet built around basic staples, that improved absorption can make a meaningful difference. There's also a psychological side to it. Real, flavorful food has been shown to support mental stability during long-term stress. People who are able to eat meals that still taste good during extended crises tend to maintain better focus, clearer thinking, and improved cooperation with others. That effect has been observed and studied. It's not just anecdotal. For storage, whole peppercorns are easy. Buy them in bulk from places like Sam's Club or Costco Wholesale, ideally in restaurant-sized quantities. Then keep them sealed in glass jars at room temperature. And one important rule: stop buying pre-ground pepper for long-term storage entirely. Now, item number 6 is where things get more controversial. Most prepping channels avoid it altogether. Even I hesitated to include it, but longtime survival planners have kept it on their private lists for decades, and the reasoning behind it is hard to ignore. Here it is. Item 6 is high-proof alcohol. To be very clear from the start, this has nothing to do with drinking. It's about having a single item that can replace multiple emergency and medical supplies when nothing else is available. In situations where pharmacies shut down and medical supply chains break apart, infections from even small cuts become one of the leading causes of death. This pattern has been seen repeatedly across major disasters and military conflicts over the past couple of centuries. A minor injury that would normally be treated quickly with antiseptics from a store can turn into a serious, potentially life-threatening problem within days when there's no access to doctors, pharmacies, or antibiotics. Alcohol at around 40% strength or higher is capable of killing bacteria on contact, functioning in a similar way to basic medical antiseptics. Because of that, some preparedness-focused individuals keep high-proof alcohol on hand as a multi-use resource for disinfecting wounds, serving as a base for homemade tinctures, acting as a fire starter in certain situations, and even as a barter item if traditional systems break down. Even military personnel and emergency responders have included similar items in personal preparedness kits for a long time due to their versatility. When sealed in its original glass container, it can remain stable for years without meaningful degradation or expiration concerns. Higher-proof spirits, such as very strong ethanol-based products, are often considered more efficient because a single bottle can serve multiple emergency functions at once. The general recommendation is to store it in a cool, dark place in its original sealed container. For many preparedness plans, 1 bottle per household is considered the bare minimum, with 2 being a more comfortable buffer. Item 5 has been feeding soldiers since World War I. It's one of those things that's so inexpensive and so overlooked today that most people walk right past it in a grocery store without even noticing it. Meanwhile, people who understand its value tend to buy it in bulk, sometimes by the case. We're talking about bouillon cubes and powder. And here's the key idea behind it. In a real emergency, 1 cube dropped into hot water can completely change a meal. That's all it takes. But there's something most people don't consider when they think about long-term survival food. The biggest problem usually isn't running out of calories. It's something called taste fatigue. After days or weeks of eating plain rice and beans, your brain can actually start to reject the food. You lose appetite, eat less, and over time that leads to low energy, a slower metabolism, and eventually a weakened immune system. That's where things can start to fall apart. This is where bouillon makes a real difference. Research into disaster survival and institutional feeding has shown that people who have access to seasoning and flavoring report significantly higher psychological resilience compared to those eating completely bland meals. In other words, flavor isn't just comfort, it helps people keep going. Bouillon is essentially concentrated stock in a dry, shelf-stable form. 1 cube can deliver strong flavor, electrolytes, and sodium that the body actually needs, all without refrigeration and with very little storage space required. It also has a long shelf life, often retaining most of its flavor for years when stored properly. Historically, versions of this were used by soldiers during World War I, and militaries have continued using similar products ever since. The general public just never really paid attention to it. Today, you can find chicken, beef, and vegetable varieties, along with powdered versions that often store even better than cubes. Keeping them sealed and protected from moisture helps extend their life even further. They're extremely affordable too, often just a few dollars per box, making it easy to store a large supply without much cost. In a situation where everything else starts to feel dull and repetitive, This is the kind of small item that can make a big difference in maintaining morale and keeping people eating properly. Item 4 is canned bacon. At first, it sounds almost absurd, like something that shouldn't exist, but it absolutely does. It tastes like real bacon and it can last up to 10 years on the shelf. So why are serious preppers quietly stocking it up? Research on disaster psychology has shown that in long-term emergencies, people don't just need food for calories. They need food that feels familiar, something that restores a sense of normal life. And bacon, especially in American households, is one of those deeply familiar comfort foods. It's not just breakfast, it's tied to routine, comfort, and stability. When you're several weeks into a major crisis and people are exhausted, stressed, and starting to make poor decisions, something as simple as real bacon can actually shift morale in a noticeable way. Studies on group survival dynamics suggest that small boosts in comfort food can improve cooperation, mood, and even decision-making under pressure. One of the most well-known options in preparedness circles is Yoder's canned bacon. It's fully cooked, hickory-smoked bacon sealed in a standard can, designed for long-term storage. It typically carries around a 10-year shelf life, but it's rarely discussed in mainstream content because demand spikes quickly whenever it gets attention online. It can usually be found for around $25 per 9-ounce can. Many people who store it recommend keeping at least 4 to 6 cans on hand and rotating them yearly. Most people initially dismiss canned bacon as a joke, until they try it. After that, it tends to become a regular part of their supply. It's one of those items that quietly separates casual stockpiling from more serious long-term preparedness. Now, item number 3 takes things to a completely different level. Item 3 is what's often called the ancient fat. Ghee stored in sealed tins. A lot of people preparing for emergencies tend to focus on canned foods, rice and beans, but they overlook one critical macronutrient that can seriously affect both physical health and mental stability over time: fat. Here's the uncomfortable reality. Fat matters more than most people realize in a long-term crisis. Regular butter, for example, can spoil within just a few days without refrigeration. Even vegetable oils don't last forever. They can go rancid within about a year in storage. When dietary fat disappears and people are left eating mostly plain starches like rice and beans, the effects build up quickly. Energy drops, mood worsens, and food becomes harder and harder to tolerate. Over time, that can seriously impact a person's ability to cope. But there is one major exception that experienced preppers quietly rely on: ghee, or clarified butter, often stored in sealed tins. Unlike regular butter, ghee has had all the water and milk solids removed, leaving behind only pure fat. That small change makes a huge difference in stability. This isn't just a modern health trend either. Ancient Ayurvedic texts describe properly stored ghee lasting for decades, or even over a century in some cases. Archaeologists have also reportedly discovered sealed containers of ghee in ancient burial sites that were still recognizable and technically usable. The reason comes down to chemistry. Without water or milk proteins, there's nothing for bacteria to feed on, and the remaining fat is highly resistant to spoilage. Even oxidation happens very slowly under the right conditions. Modern food science generally supports this stability, recognizing ghee as one of the most shelf-stable cooking fats available when stored properly. Brands like Organic Valley Ghee and Pure Indian Foods Ghee are commonly used, and even stores like Costco Wholesale sometimes carry it in bulk. Many preparedness-focused households aim for at least 6 tins per person, which can cover roughly 3 months of cooking fat needs. It's not just about calories, it's about maintaining morale, energy, and normal eating habits when everything else is limited. Stored properly in a cool, dark place and left unopened, it becomes one of the most reliable long-term fats you can keep on hand. At this point, there are only 2 items left on the list. Item 2 is considered the foundation by most serious preppers, the one item that's basically treated as non-negotiable. We're talking about non-fat powdered milk, especially the nitrogen-flushed, sealed versions that are designed for long-term storage. There's an interesting reference point that often gets brought up. Back in 2001, USDA researchers conducted long-term storage tests on canned powdered milk. They sealed it and left it on a normal shelf environment for decades with no special preservation conditions. When samples were finally analyzed about 25 years later, the results were surprising. Around 97% of the original nutritional value was still intact. That includes protein, calcium, and most key micronutrients. That finding changed how many preparedness planners think about long-term dairy storage. Because in a real emergency, dairy is usually one of the first things to disappear, not necessarily because it's out of stock, but because refrigeration and cold chain logistics fail. Once that happens, fresh milk is basically gone almost immediately, and that matters more than people think. When dairy is no longer available, you're not just losing a drink. You're losing a major source of calcium and complete protein. For children especially, long-term absence can affect bone development and growth over time. Powdered milk bypasses that entire problem. It doesn't rely on refrigeration, and it stays stable on the shelf for years when properly packaged. The best versions are nitrogen-flushed before sealing, which removes oxygen from the container. With no oxygen present, oxidation slows dramatically, which helps preserve both flavor and nutrients over time. One commonly referenced option is Augason Farms. Morning Moo's powdered milk, typically sold in sealed number 10 cans with dozens of servings per container. It stores best in a cool, dark place and can be mixed with cold water when needed. Some people even add a little vanilla or flavoring to make it more palatable, especially for kids. At current prices, fresh milk might seem inexpensive, but those costs can rise quickly during supply disruptions. Powdered milk, on the other hand, locks in supply ahead of time and avoids that volatility. That's why experienced preppers tend to store it quietly and consistently. It functions almost like a hedge against both shortages and price spikes. Because once demand spikes and people realize how useful it is for long-term food planning, availability tends to tighten quickly. Item 1 is raw honey, often described as a 3,000-year-old survival food. There's a well-known archaeological account where researchers opened an ancient Egyptian tomb and discovered a sealed jar of honey. When it was tested, it was still perfectly edible, unchanged, uncontaminated, and not spoiled in any way. That isn't just a legend. It's a documented finding that continues to get referenced because it highlights how unusual honey really is. So why does that matter today? In a modern emergency, especially when medical services are unavailable, even a small infection from a cut can become serious very quickly. In those situations, honey shifts from being a food item to something closer to a medical supply. In fact, honey is already recognized in certain medical and military contexts for its antibacterial properties. Hospitals and military medicine have both studied and used it in specific wound care applications, even though most people don't realize it. Raw honey contains natural compounds that contribute to antimicrobial activity, including enzymes that produce small amounts of hydrogen peroxide. Combined with its very low moisture content and natural acidity, it creates an environment where bacteria struggle to survive. Because there's no free water and very little oxygen available in its structure, microbial growth is extremely limited, which is why honey remains stable for so long. At the same time, global honey production is under pressure. Bee populations have declined significantly in many regions, and prices have been steadily increasing year after year. Much of what people see in stores isn't even raw honey. It's often heavily processed, filtered, and pasteurized, which removes many of the natural compounds that give honey its long-term stability and beneficial properties. What experienced preppers look for is real, raw honey stored in sealed glass jars. It's not unusual to see prices in the range of $60 to $80 per gallon, with expectations of even higher costs in the future if supply continues tightening. One simple thing to understand is that crystallization does not mean spoilage. It's actually a natural process in raw honey. If that happens, gently warming the jar restores its liquid form. A single jar of raw honey can last for decades under proper conditions, effectively spanning generations. It serves multiple roles at once: food, energy source, and in some cases an emergency wound care resource. That combination is exactly why many experienced preppers place it at the very top of their list.